Welcome to the deep dive. We're plunging into a really fascinating topic today, something that gets right to the core of how we think, how we see the world.
Absolutely.
We're looking at ideology, but maybe not how you usually think about it, not just politics, but something that actually affects you personally, your mind, your brain, even your body.
That's right. And we're using excerpts from Leor Zmigrod's book, The Ideological Brain, as our guide for this dive. It's quite a remarkable book, using science to look at the roots of ideological thinking in ways that honestly might surprise you.
Yeah, our mission here is basically to unpack these ideas, to understand what believing in an ideology really does to us, fundamentally.
And explore some of the science behind why certain minds seem, well, more drawn to rigid beliefs than others.
Get ready for maybe a few aha moments, looking at belief itself through a new lens.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. How does the source actually define ideology?
Right. At its heart, it's described as a compelling narrative, a story about the world, how it works, how it should work.
But, and this is really key, the source makes a sharp distinction between ideology and just, like, culture.
Yeah, culture is often more fluid, right? It can handle quirks, reinterpretations, even contradictions sometimes.
Exactly. Ideology, as defined here, is different. It's presented as absolutist. It gives you these fixed descriptions of reality and very strict rules prescriptions for how you must think, act, relate to others.
It basically tells you what's okay and what's absolutely not.
Yes, it sort of legislates behavior.
Yeah.
And nonconformity. That's often not just disliked, it can be seen as intolerable. Total alignment is, well, essential.
That line where disagreeing gets you punished or kicked out, that feels like where culture can tip over into ideology.
And what's really striking is that the book points out these common structures, these common ways ideologies work, no matter what they're actually about.
So whether it's nationalism or racism or certain religious movements or even some kinds of, say, eco-activism or evangelism.
Right. They tend to share these features, offering absolute, sometimes utopian answers, having really strict rules, creating that strong us versus them, that in-group feeling.
And relying on specific practices, symbol.
Yeah, all that stuff. And these similarities pop up even in ideologies that, on the surface, claim very noble goals.
Traditionally, we argue about the content of an ideology, don't we? Like, are its ideas good or bad? Are they biased? Do they hold up historically?
Exactly. We critique the ideas themselves. But the source suggests a different approach, a different challenge.
Which is?
Challenging ideologies based on what believing in them actually does to your brain and body.
Okay, now that's interesting. So using science to ask different kinds of questions.
Precisely. Questions like, does this belief system make your thinking narrower? Does it limit how you respond to things? Does it make you less sensitive, less flexible, maybe less authentic?
Does it make you more prone to violence? Does it reduce your brain's plasticity, make you see the world in stereotypes?
Yeah. Critiquing ideologies based on these kinds of neural, individual, maybe even existential consequences, using science to measure the impact.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly, talk about the brain itself. The source emphasizes this fundamental idea. Your brain is a prediction machine.
It really is. It's constantly learning patterns, trying to figure out what's coming next, building this internal model of the world.
All to maximize accuracy and minimize errors, right? For survival, self-regulation.
Yeah, and it's so good at finding patterns. It sometimes sees narratives, stories everywhere, even filling in the gaps to make things seem coherent when maybe they aren't.
And this predictive thing is key to understanding how we handle change. The book uses this great analogy, like a card matching game.
Yes, like the Wisconsin card sorting test or similar concepts. You learn a rule, maybe match by color,
Then bam, without warning, the rule changes. Now you have to match by, say, number instead.
and people react really differently. You get the adaptable type.
They notice the change, maybe feel a flicker of surprise, but not panic. They just switch strategies pretty quickly.
Yeah, they're not super stuck on the old rule. They can shift how they're thinking, adapt to what the environment is demanding now.
And then you have the rigid type.
Oh, yeah. This person hates that the rule changed. They might even refuse to believe it. Keep trying the old color rule.
Even when they keep getting that error signal, that beep.
Exactly. Clinging to this hope that things will go back to how they were, they just persevere rigidly, even when it's clearly not working.
And the point the source makes is that this kind of rigidity, this pattern you see in a simple card game.
It doesn't just stay in the game. It can actually sort of propagate upwards. It can connect to higher level rigidities in our ideological choices, our actions.
So these underlying tendencies can show up even when you're not actively thinking about politics.
That's the suggestion. These imprints can be measured, potentially.
Okay, and there's another test mentioned, right? For a different kind of flexibility.
Yes, the alternative uses test. Like, how many uses can you think of for a paperclip? Or a brick?
Ah, I know that one. Brainstorming unusual uses.
Right. And this measures what's called generative flexibility,
Mm.
your ability to kind of think malleably inside your own head, come up with new ideas spontaneously.
As opposed to the card game, which is more about reacting flexibly to an external change.
Exactly. Reactive versus generative flexibility.
Yeah.
And here's a really important finding from this line of research.
Okay.
Cognitive flexibility, measured by both these kinds of tasks, turns out to be a significant predictor of dogmatism.
Really? More than other things.
Apparently so. Among measures like verbal fluency or originality, flexibility was the standout predictor.
Wow. That implies that being open to new evidence or admitting you might be wrong, that intellectual humility, it's
Right.
not just about raw intelligence. The book says flexibility predicts this humility, even when you control for IQ.
Right. It's about mental agility, being able to search your internal landscape, shift your viewpoint.
Which connects pretty neatly to imagination, doesn't it? Both creative imagination and maybe what we could call ideological imagination.
Seems so. A flexible imagination seems linked to being flexible when you evaluate ideological claims. Rigid imagination.
Leads to rigid ideologies.
That seems to be the connection drawn. It reminds me of Jean-Paul Sartre, saying art and morality both involve invention. You wouldn't dictate to an artist exactly what to paint based on fixed rules.
Right. That ability to break norms seems crucial for both avant-garde art and for resisting rigid dogma.
Yeah. But this idea of flexibility versus rigidity,
Yeah.
it has a really dark historical echo the book mentions.
Oh.
A Nazi psychologist, Erich Rudolf Jentsch, back in the 30s, he actually created this racist typology
Oh, wow.
where perceptual flexibility, which he called the S-type, was seen as a threat. He linked it to Jews, communists, people seen as unreliable or degenerate.
And rigidities.
Rigidity, the J-type, was framed as an Aryan virtue, solid, reliable. So psychological flexibility was literally seen as a red flag in that poisonous ideology.
That's deeply disturbing. Okay, bringing it to more recent times, the source talks about real-world studies, like around Brexit.
Yes, a study looking at cognitive rigidity and voting behavior in the UK's EU referendum.
And what did it find?
It found that cognitive rigidity was, indeed, a significant predictor of voting leave.
So people who scored higher on rigidity measures were more likely to vote leave.
Correct. They were also more likely to agree with statements like, a citizen of the world is a citizen of nowhere. See national identity as very fixed, support strong borders, that idea of let nothing in.
And less willing to compromise.
Yeah, a real lack of compromise. Many felt the government had to leave the EU no matter the cost or consequences.
And this connection held up regardless of age or education.
That's what the study indicated, yes. The link between that cognitive style and political behavior seemed pretty robust across demographics.
Now, the book does acknowledge it's tricky just asking people if they're liberal or conservative, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Those labels mean different things to different people. You could have someone very dogmatic on the left call themselves extremely liberal, and someone else who's genuinely open-minded and progressive use the same label. Self-ratings can be fuzzy.
So how did researchers get around that?
One method highlighted is the identity fusion scale. It's quite clever.
How does it work?
You're shown pictures of two circles, one representing you and one representing a group, like a political party. You choose the picture that best shows how much those circles overlap for you.
Ah, so it measures how much your personal identity feels merged with the group identity.
Exactly. And using this, researchers could place people on a spectrum, from extreme left partisanship to extreme right, based on the strength of that fusion, not just the label they use.
And what did they find using that method looking at flexibility?
A really significant finding. Cognitive flexibility seems to act as a kind of buffer against extremism of all types, left and right.
So the most inflexible people were found at the extremes of both sides.
That's the pattern, yes. Extreme partisans tended to be the least flexible, regardless of which party they were fused with.
But was there any lean for the most flexible people? Were they just centrists?
Interestingly, no, not exactly pure centrists. The book presents findings suggesting the most flexible individuals often lean slightly left but critically remain nonpartisans.
So they resisted fusing too strongly with any single party.
Right, suggesting that while rigidity peaks at the extremes, maximum flexibility might align with a stance that's perhaps open to change or progressive ideas, but avoids locking into a rigid party identity.
Fascinating nuance there. Okay, so beyond these cognitive traits, the source gets into our physiology too, right? Our body's reactions.
Yeah, it talks about our emotional fingertips, these subtle, often unconscious physical responses. Not just big emotions like rage, but tiny, fast signals.
Like the startled blink experiment.
That's one example mentioned. Some studies found that when exposed to a sudden loud noise, individuals identifying as more politically conservative tended to blink more forcefully.
Suggesting maybe a stronger instinctual alarm or fear response?
That was the interpretation in some studies, yes, while liberals in those specific experiments reacted less strongly. But it's really important to add, the book notes this is complex. Replications have produced varied results, so it's not a settled picture.
Got it. And there are related ideas like sensitivity to disgust.
Right. The idea isn't that feeling disgusted makes you conservative, but that maybe people who are naturally more sensitive to feelings of disgust might find ideologies focused on purity, order, or boundary keeping more appealing.
And the source connects this to how disgust has historically been used to marginalize groups.
Exactly. Labeling groups as impure or contaminating. Again, it's about potential inclinations, not deterministic causes. Individual differences might subtly nudge minds towards certain worldviews.
The book also mentions neuroscience, like brain scans showing similar activity in like-minded people, or differences in processing certain images.
Yes, but it adds a crucial caution. Just seeing brain activity doesn't automatically tell you why or what it means in complex terms like political belief. A lit-up brain area just means that part of the brain is working. Connecting specific regions to intricate beliefs is still very much an ongoing, complex field.
Okay, so we have cognitive style, emotional responses. What about deeper biology, genetics?
The source definitely goes there. It suggests susceptibility to rigid thinking is partially influenced by your genes.
Partially. Okay. Any specifics mentioned?
Yeah, it points to genes involved in dopamine regulation, like the COMT gene, which affects dopamine in the prefrontal cortex key for higher thinking,
Uh-huh.
and the DRD2 gene, influencing dopamine receptors elsewhere in the striatum. Different versions of these genes might affect dopamine levels and distribution.
Which could then potentially influence cognitive abilities, including that flexibility we keep coming back to.
Potentially, yes. But, and this is stressed repeatedly,
Hmm.
genetics are not destiny.
Right. Not fixed outcomes.
Exactly. Genes shape potential, they create predispositions, but they don't write the entire script.
And that's where epigenetics comes in. The idea that our experiences can change how genes are expressed.
Precisely. Your life experiences can literally get inscribed onto your biology, tweaking how those genetic potentials play out over time, creating sensitivities.
The source brings up a really interesting, maybe even self-censored idea from Charles Darwin here, too.
Yes, from his autobiography. He wondered about religious belief.
What was his thought?
He speculated that constantly drumming religious doctrines into a child's developing brain could create an effect almost as powerful as an inherited instinct.
Making it incredibly difficult to shake off that belief later on.
That was his suggestion, yeah. It connects the power of repetition, ritual, and early upbringing to how deeply embedded belief systems can become.
It's not just the ideas, but the whole process of learning them.
Right. Although the source balances this by noting religion can also provide positive things, meaning, connection, ways to understand the world, fulfilling that predictive need of the brain.
And religious upbringing is often very performative, very ritualized, right from childhood.
Highly. Which likely makes its effects very deeply felt, very memorable.
Okay, let's talk about how someone might move towards extremism. The book uses a spiral metaphor.
Yeah, it's a useful visual. The idea is it's not usually a straight line. Maybe the first steps into a more extreme view are quite large.
Out on the wider loops of the spiral.
Exactly. But as you move deeper, the spiral coils tighter. The demands increase, the actions escalate, and it gets easier and faster to move further in. It becomes self-reinforcing.
And this isn't just happening in a vacuum inside someone's head. It's an interaction.
Totally. It's the interplay between your predispositions, that cognitive rigidity, maybe emotional volatility, and your environment.
So while your internal makeup matters, external triggers are crucial.
Hugely important. Things like stress, conflict, losing your job, feeling devalued. These can push people, especially those already susceptible, deeper down that spiral. A rigid ideology can feel like a lifeline to a mind that's already struggling or feeling rigid under pressure.
And there's a direct link shown between stress and cognitive flexibility.
Yes. Acute stress can impair flexibility. Some research suggests maybe more in men, but That's still being studied.
And long-term stress.
Chronic, unrelenting stress seems to have even bigger effects, potentially making thinking more rigid, more habitual. Lab studies might show recovery when the stress stops, but in real life, prolonged stress can really entrench those patterns.
Which brings us to what the source calls the nest.
Yeah, the social context, your home life, neighborhood, city, the wider culture. This is presented as a really critical third factor.
It moderates the link between your internal cognition and the pull of ideology.
That's the idea. Some environments, some nests, might actually speed up that spiral into extremism. Think social exclusion, economic hardship. They can make toxic ideas seem more appealing.
While other nests might dampen the allure of dogma.
Hopefully, yes.
Yeah.
Which leads to the question, can we intentionally design nests that despiral? Can we create environments that promote flexibility and resilience?
The source gives some powerful examples of these context effects, right?
Definitely. Like the cyberball study. It's a simple online game where you get excluded from virtual ball tossing.
Makes you feel rejected.
Exactly. And studies with individuals holding militant views found that this feeling of exclusion made them suddenly treat previously negotiable values as sacred things they'd fight and die for, just because they felt rejected.
Wow. And economic scarcity.
Also profound effects. Experiments showed that just making people think about resources being scarce increased prejudice, increased anti-Black bias, for instance. And chillingly, some neural studies showed it took white participants longer to process Black faces as fully human when scarcity was primed.
Dehumanization as a literal neural process triggered by perceived scarcity.
Yeah. Which helps explain why political rhetoric framing everything as a zero-sum battle over scarce resources can be so dangerously effective.
The book also mentions terror management theory.
Briefly, yes. The hypothesis that reminders of our own mortality might push people towards ideological extremes could be left or right, or maybe specifically towards conservatism, clinging to familiar cultural beliefs as a defense against existential dread.
And another factor. The quest for significance.
Right. The idea that extremism can also be driven by a need to feel important, to matter, especially after experiencing failure or humiliation.
And this vulnerability is worse in tougher environments.
Often, yes, particularly for young people in low-resource settings, who might be more susceptible to joining deviant groups that offer status or sense of purpose, even if it's through violence.
It reminds me of Chesamillos' idea of the captive mind.
Yes, that's mentioned too. People stuck in propaganda echo chambers, seeing the world through this distorted lens designed to only show them what they already expect, makes it almost impossible to consider alternatives fairly.
So pulling all this together, the source poses a huge political and societal question.
Which is essentially, how do we build societies where rigid, potentially harmful ideologies aren't the easiest or most attractive answers to our basic human needs for certainty, belonging, meaning?
Can we engage politically? Can we fight for change without falling into those black and white us versus them traps?
And how do you even tell the difference between a destructive ideology you should critique and, say, a philosophy or movement that genuinely inspires positive resistance and change? It's not always obvious.
The book definitely emphasizes that outcomes aren't predetermined for any individual.
Absolutely. Protective factors matter hugely. Things like your baseline cognitive flexibility, good emotional regulation skills, a supportive family, these can buffer against risks.
And sometimes prejudice might be learned from the environment, not just down to individual rigidity.
Right. Growing up in an intolerant household is different from having an inherently rigid cognitive style, though they might interact. The takeaway isn't simple. How you think matters, maybe even more than what you initially believe.
But the content matters too. And different ideologies clearly appeal for different reasons. Hierarchy versus equality, revolution versus stability, and so on.
So as we kind of bring this deep dive toward a close, let's circle back to you, the listener. The big message here seems to be that ideologies aren't just abstract theories out there.
No, they're active forces. They can literally shape your brain, how you perceive things, make you more susceptible to certain ways of thinking and behaving.
Which leads to that really vital question the source raises near the end.
If we want to reject rigid ideologies, does that mean we have to give up on activism, on solidarity, on fighting for a better world, or seeking moral clarity?
Does rejecting dogma mean we just end up blandly moderate? Apathetic?
The book's perspective seems to be, no, that's not the answer. Simple moderation. Just aiming for the center isn't enough. The center will never hold, as it quotes.
Instead, it suggests the challenge is to actively cultivate non-ideological ways of thinking and living, to consciously resist rigid doctrines, rigid identities at every opportunity.
To actively envision and work towards developing an anti-ideological brain, one that embraces complexity, creativity, flexibility, and rejects dogma.
And it leaves us with this final, quite powerful image. Imagine life is the ultimate game.
You're given instructions, you're born into a context, you have your tendencies.
But you realize, fundamentally, you are free to leave the game board. You can choose to resist irrational rules. You can work on dropping your own rigidities.
That possibility of stepping outside the prescribed lines, of exploring, adapting, choosing flexibility.
It's always there.
So the thought to leave you with is, what does it mean for you personally to cultivate that anti-ideological brain, to choose freedom and flexibility in your own thinking?